All right, now we're going to talk about boundaries. And boy, I tell you what, you talk about boundaries. I'm sure most of you are like me. There's lots of times in my life when I've went beyond a lot of boundaries. And a lot of boundaries that we have around us are sometimes not plainly seen, but there's always boundaries out there. There's always that point that we don't need to go beyond. I've been working with Ashley Adams for several weeks now with her horse Journey, and just this week we've begun to ride Journey. She's riding Journey now, and we're getting into the process of beginning to train Journey, and what we've did up to now is just to establish who's in control here. Is it Ashley or is it Journey? And we've bonded those two together now, and Ashley's in control, and Journey has begun to realize that. And so Journey is beginning to respond to everything that Ashley's asking her to do, which is where we wanted to be. And it's a wonderful experience. A lot of people don't get to experience that, but Ashley got to experience it, and it's made a real difference in her life, in able to do that. But when you bond with a horse like that, it's an unforgettable experience. But anyway, as we're in this process of training Journey and teaching Ashley at the same time, there's boundaries that horse has to learn. There's boundaries. There's things that horse cannot do. There's places that horse cannot go, and there's places that horse can go. And so that horse has to learn these boundaries in this training process. And at the same time, Ashley has to learn. There's certain areas, there's certain boundaries that she can't go beyond in order to teach this horse correctly. So she has to stay within those boundaries of teaching this horse. But that's just one example of boundaries. When we were in Oregon, up in the Northwest, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Nevada, there's a lot of wilderness land that's owned by the government. And so it's managed by the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management. They manage it. And so it's open country, it's public land. Anybody can go up there anytime they want to and hunt, fish, camp out, do whatever they want to. There's no restrictions on that. But the ranchers out in the Northwest, for several years now, they have been able to buy permits. And you can buy a permit to run one animal unit on BLM land. And so one unit is either a dry cow that's pregnant or a cow-calf combination is one unit. But they can buy these permits, and most of those ranchers up there have owned these permits for years. They just pay for them each year, renew them. But they can run a certain amount of cattle on that government land. Now, they might be running 350 head of cows on 50,000 acres. That's a lot of country to cover. And but they do have cowboys up there. They usually have at least one, maybe two cowboys that stay up there through the summer to sort of keep an eye on the cattle. But a lot of times those cattle will drift, and they'll drift off beyond the boundary of the BLM land and drift over into maybe a national park area. And so when they do, then Bureau of Land Management will call the rancher and say, hey man, you got some cattle that's drifted off over here on parkland where they're not supposed to be, and you need to get you guys to get them back. So rancher will get a hold of his cowboys, and they'll ride till they find the cattle, and they'll drive them back across the boundary. And now these boundaries are not marked. There's not any fences or anything like that, but they're boundaries. And so if they go beyond that boundary, then somebody's going to call. Not unlike in our own life, when God has set boundaries in our life. And when we go beyond those boundaries, God always gives us a call. You know, God gives us a call to let us know that we have went beyond those boundaries. Now in Psalms 32, 1 through 5, David said, blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord counts no iniquity, and whose spirit there is no deceit. For when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groanings all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me, my strength was dried up as by the heat of summer. I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not cover my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the iniquity of my sin. And so David's talking about confessing his transgressions, and if you look up transgress, you can find the definition to transgress means to go beyond the boundary. In other words, David is saying that there was a time when he went beyond the boundary. He went beyond where God wanted him to be. And we know in the life of David that happened to him on more than one occasion. But David went beyond the boundaries that God had set for him in life. But he said when he did that, when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groanings all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was dried up as by the heat of summer. Now, when we go beyond the boundaries that God has set for us in our life, we're going to feel the presence of God in our life. We're going to feel God weighing heavy on us. And anytime we drift off out there into sin or drift out past the boundaries where we're supposed to go, God is going to go way heavy on us, on our spirit, on our conscience, He's going to weigh heavy on us. You ever been out there? You ever been out there? You ever been out past the boundary Amen. That God wanted you to go? And did you feel the presence of God?
Amen.
Trying to push you back across that boundary? Did you feel God like the guys from the BLM? Did you feel God picking up the phone and saying, hey man, you've strayed over the boundary, you need to get back? God's going to do that, just like the BLM calling them ranchers about their cattle straying. And to transgress means to go beyond the boundary. Transgression refers to presumptuous sin, which is taking liberties. In other words, we talked the last 3 weeks about grace, and Paul wrote there in Romans, about if God has grace to cover sin, why don't I just keep on sinning because God's got enough grace to cover it? Well, that's taking liberty. That's taking liberty with sin. You can't do that. Transgression refers to presumptuous, taking liberty, sin. To transgress is to choose to intentionally disobey. Transgression is willful trespassing. That's when you cross the boundary that God has set, the parameters that God has set in your life as a Christian. And you take the liberty to say, well, okay, I'm a Christian, I know I'm saved, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. Even though God says I shouldn't do this, I'm going to do it anyway. That's transgression. That's going beyond the boundaries. That's willful trespassing. Taking liberties was sin. And I'll give you another example of boundaries. The first example I gave you was about a rancher and his cattle going over the boundaries. Now, the rancher didn't intentionally allow that to happen. It just happened. Even though they crossed the boundaries, they trespassed on land where they wasn't supposed to be, they got a call and they went and they gathered and they brought him back. It wasn't intentional. I worked for a man one time, and in Somerville, Texas, between Somerville and Caldwell, Texas, about 30 miles east of College Station, is a lake called Lake Somerville. And Lake Somerville was made when they dammed up Yawall Creek. Now, Yawall Creek came down through the country there. It was a lot like Amicalola Creek. It was more of a river than it was a creek, but it was called Yawall Creek. And so they dammed it up and made Lake Somerville. Well, when they dammed that up and made that lake, they took in all of that land in that Yawall bottom, what we call the Yawall bottom, 3,000 acres of land they took in. Well, these people that I worked for on the ranch, a man named Billy Lamb and Betty Lamb, they took part of Billy's ranch when they dammed it up and made that lake. They just made him fence it off. He had to build a fence between his property and this Yawall Creek bottom, this 3,000 acres that the government took in, even though that was his ranch. Of course, they paid him for it, but it wasn't, like millions of dollars. They paid him for the land, but they took in part of his ranch and they had to build a fence. Well, it was a wilderness, primitive camping. You couldn't take a vehicle down there. You could ride a bicycle, ride a horse, walk, but you couldn't take a motorized vehicle. It's all primitive camping and everything. And they let this thing just grow up into a wilderness. Well, it had a lot of good grass down there. So me and Mr. Billy, we had us a gate in this fence that went into that bottom. So every now and then we just open that gate and let our cattle drift off down in that bottom. And sometimes they'd be down there 2 or 3 weeks before they'd call and say, "Hey, Mr. Lamb, you got some cattle down there in the bottom, you need to get them out." Well, we'd get our horses and we'd go down there and we'd drive those cattle out. We'd wait about a week and or so, let it kind of settle down. We'd open the gate again, and let them out. They'd be down there a week or two and they'd go, "Hey, Mr. Lamb, you got cows out down here?" We'd go get them. So we'd do that through the summer, and get some free grazing down there. Well, Mrs. Lamb, she owned a bunch of longhorn cattle. And she had 15 steers that she was raising to make, them big trophy steers. And these dudes were about 2 years old. They were pretty good size. They probably weighed 900 pounds and had a pretty good little set of horns on them. We had 15 of them. Mr. Billy said, "Let's turn them steers out in that bottom." We turned them steers out in that bottom, and guess what? We ain't found them steers yet. I think the government finally said, "Hey, we're done with this little deal." And I think they gathered them up and hauled them to the sale barn. But they disappeared. So that was a good bit of money, and Mrs. Lamb wasn't too happy about it. But I don't think it's unlike God sometimes. I mean, we cross that boundary and we cross that boundary and we cross that boundary, but there's going to come a reckoning. There's going to come a day when God says, I'm done. That's enough. I don't think he's just going to keep, not in a Christian's life. Not in a Christian's life is he going to allow that to keep going. But God's boundaries are called commandments. And in Deuteronomy 6:4-6, God says, "Listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. And you must love God. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. And you must commit yourselves wholeheartedly to these commands that I am giving you today." God gave his people commandments. In other words, boundaries. You know, this is, you've got to live within these commandments, within these boundaries that I set for you. You are my people. You're going to be my people. I'm your God. I am the Lord God. You're going to worship me, the only God. You're not going to have any other gods before me. You're not going to make any graven images. You're going to worship me. And I'm going to be your God. You're going to be my people. And you're going to live within these boundaries. And so he laid these laws down, gave them to Moses to give to the Israelites. And you're going to live within these boundaries, within these laws. Now, there's one thing about God's boundaries. God's boundaries don't move. Okay? And we're living in a day and age when everybody wants to move God's boundaries. They want to say this doesn't apply anymore. You know, God doesn't look on that like he used to. Well, sorry, but God ain't changed. And his boundaries don't move. And in Psalms 89:34, he says, no, I will not break my covenant. I will not take back a single word I said. And then in Hebrews 13:8, it says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so the God that we worship, the God that we sang to tonight, the God that we came here tonight to worship, and Jesus Christ, his Son, they're the same yesterday as they are today, and the same they're going to be tomorrow. And the boundaries don't change. The boundaries don't change. The boundaries are still there. And God's people will live within the boundaries. Now, God's boundaries can be violated. They can be violated. Now, this scripture reading is a little lengthy, so I didn't put it in the bulletin to keep from taking up a lot of space. But it says in Deuteronomy 30th chapter, beginning with verse 11, it says, this command I am giving you today is not too difficult for you to understand, and it is not beyond your reach. It is not kept in heaven, so distant that you must ask, who will go up to heaven and bring it down so we can hear it and obey? It is not kept beyond the sea, so far away that you must ask, who will cross the sea to bring it to us so we can hear it and obey? No, the message is very close at hand. It is on your lips and in your heart so that you can obey it. Now listen, today I am giving you a choice between life and death, between prosperity and disaster. Now, God says right here, I'm giving you a choice. And we have a choice. We have a choice to either live within the boundaries or to cross the boundaries in transgression. For I command you this day to love the Lord your God and to keep his commands, decrees, and regulations by walking in his ways. If you do this, you will live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you and the land you are about to enter and occupy. But if your heart turns away and you refuse to listen, and if you are drawn away to serve and worship other gods, then I warn you now that you will certainly be destroyed. You will not live a long, good life in the land you are crossing the Jordan to occupy. In other words, God says, I'm telling you right now, guys, if you live within these boundaries, I'm going to bless you. But if you choose to cross that boundary and to worship other gods and to not listen to me, then you certainly will be destroyed. Today I have given you the choice between life and death, between blessing and curses. Now I call on heaven and earth to witness the choice you make. Oh, that you would choose life so that you and your descendants might live. You can make this choice by loving the Lord your God, obeying him, and committing yourself firmly to him. This is the key to your life. And if you love and obey the Lord, you will live long in the land the Lord swore to give your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is the key to your life. If you love and obey the Lord, you will live long in the land. God's boundaries can be violated by your own choosing. God's boundaries, the law of love. In James 1:25, James says, "But if you look carefully into the perfect law that sets you free, and if you do what it says and don't forget what you heard, then God will bless you for doing it." If you look carefully into the perfect law that sets you free. Now, Israel couldn't keep the laws. They disobeyed God. They worshiped other gods. They worshiped idols. They turned their back on God. They couldn't keep the law. Jesus came because they couldn't keep the law. Jesus came. He said, "I come not to do away with the law, but to fulfill the law." Jesus came, and he lived his life keeping the law completely. And because of that perfect life he led, then he could be the lamb without spot and blemish that could be sacrificed that you and I might have life. But that perfect law that set us free from having to worry about keeping the law in order to be saved. Because there's not a one of us here tonight that could keep the law and expect to be saved. Because Jesus said that if you just broke one little bitty law, then you've broken them all. So we couldn't keep the law. The Israelites couldn't keep the law. We wouldn't be able to keep the law. That's what we talked about in last week's Bible study, was when Paul met with the apostles at Jerusalem, Paul and Barnabas and Titus. And Peter, I think it was, that said, "Why should we burden the Gentiles by telling them they have to keep the law when we couldn't keep it ourselves?" So salvation has nothing to do with keeping the law. It has everything to do with the grace of God and putting our faith and trust in Jesus Christ. And so that perfect law that set us free from having to worry about keeping the law. Could you imagine? I was there one time, but I don't remember what it was like. But can you imagine having to live your life worried about every single thing you've done, if you've done too much to keep you from being saved? Get down to your dying days and wonder if you did enough good to be saved, or did I do too much bad, I'm going to hell? Is that not painful?
Amen.
To have to think about that? But God's perfect law, the gospel of Jesus Christ, set us free from that. God's perfect law said in Matthew 22:37-40, said, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important: love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments." They tried to trick Jesus up, the Pharisees, with the laws. And they're like, "Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? You know, of all the commandments, what's the greatest?" And Jesus says, "Love God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind." And you know what, guys? If you love God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind, you think about that just a second. I mean, we're talking about sold out to God, okay? We're talking about being totally sold out to God, that we love God with all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our mind, our strength. We're sold out to God. Then we keep the first 4 commandments that was handed down to Moses to give in the 10 commandments. And if we love our neighbor as ourself, then we've completed and we've kept the other 6 commandments. And Jesus said the entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these 2 commandments. In other words, that's what God said, or Jesus said, the greatest commandment, and the second one just like it. Love God with all your heart, soul, and your strength, your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself.
Amen.
That's all we got to do. And if we love God with all of our heart, soul, and our strength, and our mind, we're going to stop doing a lot of things we do that brings shame to God and breaks His heart. We're going to stop doing a lot of those things. And if we love our neighbor as ourselves, then we're not going to be jealous of our neighbor. We're not going to be greedy and try to get what he has. We're not going to try to get his possessions. We're not going to try to get his wife. We're not going to do all of those things because we're going to love him as ourselves. And when we do those 2 things, we've done everything that Jesus says we need to do. If we do those things, the entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these 2 commandments. And Jesus said in John 13:34, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another.
Amen.
Let's pray. Father, I just thank you tonight for your word.